What we have here is a silk velvet, probably dating from the years between 1600 and 1630 or 40, made in the most western part of Asia Minor, now Turkey. It was made in the small but very old and important city of Bursa, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. In the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched all the way from Southeast Europe to North Africa and comprised what we now think of the Middle East. This type of textile was made of many different kinds of materials. The rich red of the background was silk, and this silk was most likely imported from Iran. The caravans that carried the silk arrived once a year, and everybody waited to welcome them into the city. The weavers and the other craftsmen, but merchants as well, and from all over Europe, from Italy and France, and even from Britain. Also awaiting the arrival of the caravans were the inspectors and the tax collectors. They wanted their cut too. And we know that the revenues from the silk caravans went a long way to funding the Ottoman treasury. Silk, though, is naturally white or maybe light ivory, and it had to be dyed. And this crimson color is made probably of two dyes. The first is a plant dye, and it comes from a root which is native to Anatolia and to other parts of the world. This is madder, and it gives a kind of orangey red. The second type of dye is what we call crimson or kermes, and in the years before the 15th century, it was collected from tiny parasitic insects harvested from oak trees. But by the time the 16th and 17th century rolled around, it was increasingly replaced by a dye that was imported from much further away, from Mexico, in fact, where the tiny parasitic insects called cochineal, related to kermes, were collected, crushed, and brought by ship via the Atlantic to the Ottoman Empire. Cochineal gives a purpley red, and together they make these crimsons. The second type of dye is the blue we see in the details, the sort of flame-like stitching on the inside of the roundels, at their borders, and around each pearl. The blue also had to be imported, and this time from the other direction. It's indigo, and it comes from India. It was also dyed only once it reached Bursa. In these large areas, which now appear sort of tan, we're going to have to use our imaginations for this. These large areas were once covered with gold and silver. It's now mostly abraded. The gold and silver actually is a type of thread as well, and it's a silk core that's been wound around with gold, gilded gold, or silver foil, ribbon-like, if you can imagine. Now, this was made in a special type of workshop. It's called kalaptan in Ottoman Turkish. As you can imagine, it too comprised materials that came from pretty far away. The silk, like the rest of the silk we see here, probably came from Iran, but the metal had to come from even further away. In the years before the 15th and 16th century, silver was probably coming from the mines of the Balkans, in Serbia, Bosnia, and northern Bulgaria. But by this point, we're also pretty sure that New World silver was arriving in the Ottoman Empire, coming again mostly from Mexico, but also from the famous Potosi mines in Bolivia. The gold, though, again in the years before the 16th century, probably came from the Western Sahara in the area that's now Mali. But again, by the 17th century, when this textile was made, it too was coming from the New World, probably from Peru, again via the Atlantic trade and Spain into the Mediterranean and to the Ottomans. Hidden underneath all of this silk was a much more humble material, cotton. Cotton came from the river valleys of the Aegean, somewhat south of Bursa, in fact. It was spun by women, probably working at home, and made it to Bursa in small periodic shipments. Now, even though the cotton might have been humble, it was really important. It was thick and a little bit sticky, and it helped glue and anchor all of the silk elements in this textile together. The cotton gave it this stiffness or this heaviness, and this was absolutely necessary to it because this type of textile was most often used as upholstery. It really had to be able to take somewhere. It had to stand up to use. What we see here in this vitrine at Shangri-La today is probably 1/4 of a much bigger piece. It would have been stitched with 3 other pieces in perfect mirror symmetry. The border running around all 4 pieces would have made it seem like a complete whole, and this was pleasing both to the eye and to the mind.